My name is Alina, and I'm 34 years old. Right now, I'm sitting in the corner office of a building I own, looking out at a city that once felt impossibly far away from the girl who used to scrub floors on her hands and knees while her stepsisters laughed from the couch. If someone had told that girl, the quiet one with the second-hand clothes and the permanent bruise on her self-esteem, that she would one day control a business empire worth over $200 million, she would have thought they were mocking her, just like everyone else always did. Before we continue, drop a like right now so I know you're locked in. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell so you never miss the next revenge story that'll leave your jaw on the floor. But here I am, and the people who spent a decade trying to convince me I was worthless, they're about to learn exactly how wrong they were. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense without context. It doesn't make sense without understanding the particular kind of cruelty that masquerades as family, the slow erosion of identity that happens when you're told every day that you don't belong. My mother died when I was 8 years old. Cancer, the aggressive kind that doesn't give you time to say goodbye properly. One day she was braiding my hair and telling me I was her little star, and 6 months later I was standing beside a casket that seemed too small to contain everything she had been. My father, Thomas Ashford, was devastated. He had loved my mother deeply, and her death broke something inside him that never fully healed. For 2 years it was just the two of us, rattling around in our modest house, learning how to exist without the person who had held us together. He tried his best, I know that now, but grief makes people vulnerable. It makes them reach for anything that might fill the void. Enter Victoria. Victoria Crane was beautiful in the way that sharp things are beautiful, all angles and precision and cold elegance. She was a widow herself, with 2 daughters close to my age, Margaret, who was 10 when they moved in, and Isabel, who was 9. My father met her at a grief support group, which should have been a red flag in retrospect. Some people go to those groups to heal, others go to hunt. Within a year of meeting, my father married Victoria. Within 2 years, our modest house had been sold, and we had moved into Victoria's much larger home across town. Within 3 years, the man who used to take me for ice cream and call me his little star had become a ghost, drifting through rooms without making eye contact, letting Victoria make every decision that mattered. I don't know if she threatened him, manipulated him, or simply wore him down until he had nothing left. What I know is that by the time I was 13, I had become invisible in my own family. Not invisible in the metaphorical sense, where people ignore your feelings. Invisible in the practical sense, where your existence is acknowledged only when there's work to be done. Victoria had very specific ideas about her daughter's futures. Margaret was going to be a socialite, a woman of influence who married well and maintained the family's status. Isabel was going to be an artist, someone whose creative genius was nurtured and funded regardless of cost. Both of them were destined for greatness, and every resource in the household was funneled toward making that vision a reality. I, on the other hand, was slow. That was the word Victoria used when she talked about me to her friends, to the neighbors, to anyone who might wonder why the quiet girl in the worn-out clothes was always doing chores while her stepsisters lounged by the pool. Elena has some challenges, she would say, her voice dripping with false compassion. We're doing our best to give her a simple life that doesn't overwhelm her limited abilities. It was a lie, of course. I wasn't slow. My grades were excellent, better than Margaret's, better than Isabel's, but Victoria made sure no one ever saw them. Report cards disappeared. Parent-teacher conferences were mysteriously missed. Whenever I tried to speak up to correct the narrative, I was shut down with a look, a threat, or something worse. Something worse came in many forms: extra chores as punishment for talking back, meals withheld for disrespecting the family, isolation during holidays because I hadn't earned the right to participate. By the time I was 16, I had internalized so much of their conditioning that I almost believed it myself. Maybe I was slow, maybe I was worthless, maybe this was all I deserved. My father died when I was 17, heart attack, sudden and unexpected. The doctors said it was congenital, a ticking time bomb that had been waiting to go off. But I sometimes wonder if it was simpler than that. I wonder if his heart just gave up, tired of carrying the weight of what he had allowed to happen. At his funeral, I cried quietly in the back row, while Victoria and her daughters accepted condolences in the front, dressed in expensive black and playing the role of grieving family with practiced ease. Not a single person came to check on me. Not a single person seemed to realize that the man in the casket was my actual father, not theirs. After the funeral, Victoria called me into her study, a room I was normally forbidden from entering, and laid out my future with the same brisk efficiency she might use to order groceries. "Your father left some money," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. a small inheritance for you, which I will manage until you turn 25. Given your limitations, it's best that you don't have access to significant funds. You'd only waste them." I stared at her, too numb to argue. "In the meantime, you will continue to contribute to this household. You're 18 now, so legally you could leave, but we both know you have nowhere to go and no skills to support yourself. Stay here, help with the house, and when you turn 25, you'll receive your inheritance and can figure out your own path." It sounded almost reasonable when she said it. That was Victoria's gift, making cruelty sound like kindness, making exploitation feel like favor. So I stayed. For 7 more years, I stayed. I cooked their meals and cleaned their rooms. I did their laundry and ran their errands. I served at their dinner parties, silent and efficient, while guests assumed I was hired help rather than family. Margaret and Isabel treated me with casual contempt, occasionally acknowledging my existence only to criticize my work or demand something beyond my duties. "Alina, my room needs to be spotless by tonight. I have guests coming." "Alina, you pressed my dress wrong. Do it again." "Alina, why are you even here? God, you're so pathetic." I absorbed it all. I became what they told me I was, a shadow, a servant, a nothing. But here's the thing about being invisible. You see everything. You hear conversations that people assume you're too stupid to understand. You notice details that those in power overlook. And if you're patient, if you're very, very patient, you can use what you learn. Victoria believed she was managing my inheritance. What she didn't know was that my father had created a second account, one that even his wife didn't know about. He had set it up shortly before he died, transferring a portion of his assets into a trust that was managed by an attorney who had been his friend since childhood. The trust was designed to activate on my 21st birthday, and it contained not just money, but information. Documents proving that my mother's family had owned significant property that had been quietly transferred into Victoria's name after my father's death. The attorney, Mr. Hendricks, contacted me on my 21st birthday via a letter sent to a P.O. box I had secretly set up years earlier. Meeting him in his small, cluttered office on the outskirts of town felt like stepping into another dimension, a world where someone actually saw me as a person rather than a problem. "Your father wanted me to tell you something," Mr. Hendricks said, sliding a folder across his desk. "He said he was sorry. He knew what was happening in that house, and he was too weak to stop it. This was his way of trying to make it right." Inside the folder was a summary of the trust, nearly $800,000 in liquid assets, plus documentation proving that the properties Victoria claimed as her own, including the house I had been scrubbing floors in for years, had originally belonged to my mother's family and had been improperly transferred after my father's death. The legal term was fraud, the practical term was theft. But Mr. Hendricks advised caution. Victoria had connections, lawyers, judges, business associates who owed her favors. If I went after her directly, she would bury me in litigation for years, draining whatever resources I had until I was left with nothing. The smarter play, he said, was to build something first, to become someone that couldn't be dismissed or defeated. So that's what I did. I didn't confront Victoria. I didn't even let on that anything had changed. I continued playing the role of the slow, invisible stepdaughter, continued scrubbing and cooking and serving. But in the hours when they thought I was sleeping, I was studying. Business courses online, real estate certification, investment strategies. I devoured information like someone dying of thirst who had finally found water. And I began to build. The $800,000 from my father's trust became the seed capital for my first investment, a small, struggling apartment building on the edge of the city. I bought it under an LLC with a name that meant nothing, renovated it using contractors I found through careful research, and within 2 years had turned it into a profitable property generating steady rental income. That income funded my next acquisition, and the one after that, and the one after that. By the time I was 25, the age when Victoria had promised to give me my inheritance, I had quietly accumulated a real estate portfolio worth several $1,000,000. I had also hired a team of lawyers far more formidable than anyone Victoria knew, and they had been building a case against her for years. The inheritance she finally presented to me was a joke, $50,000, a fraction of what my father had actually left. She delivered it with a condescending smile, as if she were doing me an enormous favor. "This should help you get started somewhere," she said. "I suggest you use it wisely. Given your limitations, it's probably the most money you'll ever have." I took the check, I thanked her, and I walked out of that house for the last time, knowing that she had no idea what was coming. The next 4 years were about consolidation, building, preparing. I moved into one of my own properties, a modest apartment that I kept deliberately unremarkable in case anyone from Victoria's world happened to see it. I continued expanding my real estate holdings, moving from residential properties to commercial spaces, from single buildings to entire developments. I diversified into other industries, a small chain of boutique hotels, a logistics company that served the hospitality sector, a technology startup that developed property management software. Each acquisition was strategic, each investment calculated. I wasn't just building wealth, I was building leverage. I wanted to be in a position where Victoria and her daughters couldn't touch me, couldn't threaten me, couldn't spin their narratives without facing overwhelming evidence to the contrary. I also spent those years learning everything I could about their lives, not through surveillance or anything illegal, simply by paying attention, by cultivating sources, by being patient. Victoria's social circle talked freely, never suspecting that the invisible girl they had dismissed might be listening through intermediaries. What I learned was illuminating. Victoria's finances, it turned out, were not as solid as her lifestyle suggested. The properties she had stolen from my mother's estate had been mortgaged and remortgaged to fund her daughter's expensive tastes. Margaret's society wedding 5 years ago had cost a fortune they didn't have, paid for with borrowed money against borrowed money. Isabel's art career was funded entirely by Victoria, with no actual income to show for years of supposed creative genius. The house itself, the mansion where I had spent a decade as an unpaid servant, was leveraged to the breaking point. One significant expense, one unexpected financial shock, and the whole facade would come crashing down. I filed that information away and continued to wait. The opportunity came in the form of a wedding. Isabel, following in her sister's footsteps, had gotten engaged to a man from a moderately wealthy family, not wealthy enough to solve their financial problems, but wealthy enough to maintain appearances. The wedding was planned for the following spring, and it was going to be the social event of the season. Victoria had rented the most prestigious venue in the city, hired the most sought-after caterers, commissioned the most elaborate floral arrangements. What she didn't know was that I owned the venue. Not obviously, not under my own name. The property was held through a subsidiary of one of my holding companies, managed by a team that had no idea who the ultimate owner was. Victoria had negotiated the rental contract with a pleasant event coordinator who reported to a regional manager who reported to a director who reported to me. When my intelligence network, really just a few well-placed acquaintances who owed me favors, informed me about the wedding plans, I began to put the final pieces in place. First, I acquired the catering company. This was actually easier than expected. They had been looking for investment capital, and my offer was generous enough to ensure I gained controlling interest. The owner stayed on as the face of the business, never knowing that his new primary investor had a personal stake in an upcoming event. Second, I had my lawyers finalize the case against Victoria. Every fraudulent transfer, every forged document, every stolen asset, we had documentation for all of it. The case was airtight, the evidence overwhelming. All that remained was deciding when to strike. Third, and this was the most satisfying part, I arranged to purchase the mansion itself. Victoria had recently taken out yet another mortgage, using the property as collateral for a loan from a regional bank to cover Isabel's wedding expenses. That bank, through a complex series of acquisitions I had engineered over the previous year, was now a subsidiary of my financial services division, which meant that when Victoria defaulted on her loan, something my analysts predicted would happen within 6 months of the wedding, I would be in a position to foreclose. I could have pulled the trigger at any moment, but I waited. I wanted the confrontation to happen at the perfect time, in the perfect setting, with maximum impact. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in May. I received my invitation. Yes, Victoria actually invited me, probably to maintain appearances, and RSVP'd that I would attend. I spent weeks preparing not just my outfit, a designer dress that cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe, but my mental state. I needed to be calm, controlled, and absolutely devastating. The day arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind of day that seems designed for celebration and romance. I drove to the venue, my venue, in a car that cost more than the down payment on Victoria's original house, though I chose a model subtle enough that it wouldn't immediately scream wealth. The venue was beautiful, I had to admit, a converted estate with manicured gardens, elegant ballrooms, and the kind of timeless architecture that photographs well and impresses guests. I had purchased it 3 years ago and invested significantly in renovations, making it one of the premier event spaces in the region. The irony of Victoria choosing this particular venue for her stepdaughter's wedding was almost too perfect. I arrived early, slipping into the crowd of guests who were already mingling on the lawn. A few people glanced at me with vague recognition. Wasn't that the slow girl who used to live with the Ashfords? But no one approached. I was still invisible to them, still beneath notice. Good. That would make what came next even more satisfying. The ceremony was held in the garden, under an arch dripping with flowers that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Isabel looked beautiful, I supposed, in the way that expensive styling and professional makeup can make almost anyone look beautiful. Her groom, a man named Preston whose main qualification seemed to be his family name, smiled with the vacant contentment of someone who has never faced a real challenge. Margaret sat in the front row, elegant and bored. Victoria sat beside her, radiating the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had orchestrated everything perfectly. Neither of them noticed me, sitting near the back, watching with the patience of someone who has waited years for this moment. The reception was held inside the main ballroom, all crystal chandeliers and crisp white linens. I found my assigned seat, predictably at the worst table, near the kitchen entrance, alongside distant relatives and obligatory invites, and settled in to wait. Dinner was served by the catering staff I now employed. The food was excellent, as it should be. I had personally reviewed the menu weeks ago. The wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and lowering guards. Toasts were made, tears were shed, and everyone agreed that it was the most wonderful wedding they had ever attended. I waited until the dancing had started, until the formal parts of the evening were over, and people were relaxed, half-drunk, and fully invested in the celebration. Then I stood up and made my way to the front of the room. The DJ was a young man I had spoken with before the event, slipping him a generous tip and explaining that I would need to make an announcement at some point during the reception. He had agreed without question. A guest announcement wasn't unusual at weddings, and when I approached him now, he simply handed me the microphone and stepped aside. The music faded, and the room gradually quieted as people realized someone was about to speak. I saw Victoria's head turn, saw the flicker of confusion cross her face as she registered who was holding the microphone. "Good evening," I said, my voice clear and steady. "For those who don't know me, and that's probably most of you, my name is Alina Ashford. I'm Victoria's stepdaughter." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victoria's expression shifted from confusion to wariness. "I know what you're thinking," I continued. "Why is she up there? She's the slow one, the limited one, the one who used to clean the toilets at family gatherings. Surely she doesn't have anything important to say." Nervous laughter from some of the guests. Victoria's face had gone pale. "But I do have something important to say. Several things, actually, and I think it's time for everyone in this room to hear the truth." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to build tension. "First, I want to talk about this venue. Beautiful, isn't it? One of the finest event spaces in the region. Victoria chose it because it represents everything she wants people to believe about her family: elegance, prestige, success." I smiled. "What Victoria doesn't know is that I own it. This building, these grounds, the staff serving your dinner, all of it belongs to me." The murmur became a wave of shock. Victoria rose from her seat, her face twisted with fury. "That's absurd," she snapped. "You're lying. You've always been delusional, Alina, but this." "I'm not finished," I said calmly. "The catering company, I own that too. Acquired it about 6 months ago, actually. They do excellent work. I highly recommend them for any future events." Victoria was moving toward me now, her heels clicking against the dance floor. Margaret had grabbed her arm, trying to hold her back, but she shook her off. "And then there's the matter of the house," I continued. "The mansion where I spent 10 years as an unpaid servant. The property that belonged to my mother's family before Victoria forged documents to steal it after my father died." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the staff had stopped moving, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "Victoria took out a mortgage on that property last month to pay for this wedding. The loan was issued by a bank that, through a series of acquisitions I orchestrated, is now under my control, which means that when she defaults, and she will default, because she has no actual income and no remaining assets to leverage, I will foreclose. And then, Victoria, the house you stole from my family will finally be returned to its rightful owner." Victoria was standing in front of me now, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her perfectly composed facade crumbling in real time. "You can't do this," she hissed. "I'll sue you. I'll destroy you. You're nothing. You've always been nothing." "I'm sorry," I said, my voice gentle, almost sympathetic, "but that's not accurate. I'm worth approximately $237 million as of this morning's portfolio valuation. I own 17 commercial properties, 3 hotel chains, a logistics company, a tech startup, and as we've established, this venue and the company catering your daughter's wedding. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a folded document. What I have here is a preliminary notice of foreclosure on the mansion at 1742 Westbrook Lane. Under the terms of the loan you signed, you have 30 days from the date of this notice to either pay the outstanding balance in full or vacate the property. I handed her the document. She stared at it without seeing, her hands trembling. You have 30 days, Victoria. I suggest you use them wisely. I turned to face the rest of the room, the stunned guests, the horrified wedding party, the groom who looked like he was calculating how quickly he could annul his marriage. I apologize for the disruption to your evening, I said. Please enjoy the rest of the reception. The venue and catering are fully paid for, regardless of any personal conflicts. I wouldn't want Isabel's special day to be completely ruined. I handed the microphone back to the DJ and began walking toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Victoria screaming, incoherent rage and disbelief, while Margot tried to calm her and Isabel burst into tears. Guests were whispering, pulling out phones, probably already composing messages to everyone they knew. I didn't look back. I walked out of the ballroom, through the foyer, and into the cool spring night. My car was waiting in the parking lot. I slid into the driver's seat, took a deep breath, and allowed myself a small smile. It was done. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks, with the inevitability of a controlled demolition. Victoria attempted to fight the foreclosure, of course. She hired lawyers, filed motions, claimed that I had obtained my ownership through fraudulent means, but my legal team was prepared for every objection, armed with documentation that proved the opposite, that Victoria was the one who had committed fraud, that the properties she claimed as hers had been stolen from my mother's estate, that she had systematically deprived me of my rightful inheritance for over a decade. The judge who reviewed the case was unimpressed by Victoria's claims and unmoved by her tears. He granted the foreclosure, and in a separate ruling, ordered Victoria to pay restitution for the assets she had improperly taken from my father's estate. Margot and Isabel scrambled to distance themselves from their mother, suddenly discovering that their social connections were far less reliable than they had believed. When the story hit the local papers, Society matriarch exposed as fraud, screamed one headline, their supposed friends evaporated like morning mist. No one wanted to be associated with a family whose carefully constructed image had been so thoroughly destroyed. Isabel's marriage lasted approximately 6 weeks. Preston's family, it turned out, had been interested in an alliance with the prestigious Ashfords, not with a scandal-plagued family facing financial ruin. The annulment was quiet and quick, and Isabel moved back in with her mother, into a small apartment, since the mansion was no longer an option. Margot fared slightly better, primarily because she had married years ago and her husband had his own resources, but her social standing never recovered. The invitations stopped coming. The charity boards asked for her resignation. The country club membership was quietly revoked. As for Victoria, she never fully recovered from the public humiliation. The woman who had spent decades cultivating an image of elegance and control was now universally recognized as a fraud and a thief. She attempted to rebuild, to spin the narrative in her favor, but the evidence against her was too overwhelming, and her former allies were too eager to distance themselves. The last I heard, she was living in a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, supported by a small allowance from Margot's husband, who had agreed to help only to prevent further embarrassment to his family name. I moved into the mansion at 1742 Westbrook Lane about 2 months after the foreclosure was finalized. The first thing I did was tear out the study, where Victoria had informed me about my limited abilities. I replaced it with a library, filled with first editions and comfortable chairs and windows that let in the morning light. The room where I had slept as a servant, a tiny space in the basement, barely large enough for a cot, I converted into a wine cellar. It seemed fitting to transform a place of humiliation into something that brought pleasure. I hired a full staff to help maintain the property, housekeepers, groundskeepers, a chef who prepared meals I could actually sit down and enjoy rather than serve. I paid them well, treated them with respect, and made sure they knew their work was valued. Some people might say I was trying to prove something. Maybe I was, but mostly I was just trying to live the life that had been stolen from me, surrounded by comfort, free from cruelty, finally at peace. About 6 months after I took possession of the mansion, I received a letter. It was from Victoria, handwritten on cheap stationery, the ink slightly smeared as if she had been crying while writing. The letter was long and rambling, filled with justifications and excuses. She had only been trying to protect her daughters. She hadn't realized how much I was suffering. My father had wanted her to manage the estate. Everything she had done was out of love. The final paragraph, however, cut through the self-deception. I know you won't believe me, but I am sorry. Not for wanting the best for my children, any mother would do the same, but for not seeing you, for treating you as less than human, for taking away your voice and your identity and your birthright. I was cruel and I was wrong, and I will carry that with me for the rest of my life. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Did I forgive her? I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word. What she had done to me, the decade of servitude, the systematic destruction of my self-worth, the theft of my inheritance, couldn't be undone with an apology. Some wounds scar rather than heal. But I also couldn't summon the rage I had once felt. Victoria had lost everything: her reputation, her wealth, her social standing, her daughter's respect. She was living out her final years in obscurity and regret, while I sat in the mansion she had coveted, surrounded by the wealth she had tried to steal. Justice, I decided, had been served. Vengeance, at this point, would be redundant. I never wrote back. The years that followed were quieter, focused less on settling old scores and more on building something meaningful. I established a foundation in my mother's name, dedicated to supporting young people who had aged out of the foster care system or escaped abusive family situations. The foundation provided scholarships, housing assistance, job training, and mentorship, all the things I wished someone had offered me during my darkest years. I continued to grow my business empire, though I became more selective about acquisitions. I focused on companies that treated their employees well, that contributed positively to their communities, that aligned with values I cared about. My net worth continued to climb, but it became less about the numbers and more about what those numbers allowed me to do. I also, slowly and cautiously, began to open myself up to relationships. For years, I had kept people at arm's length. The lesson I had learned from my stepfamily was that vulnerability was weakness, that letting people in only gave them opportunities to hurt you. But that kind of isolation is its own form of prison, and eventually I realized that I had escaped one cage only to build another. I started with small steps, reconnecting with Mr. Hendricks, the attorney who had helped me access my father's trust. He became something like a mentor, offering advice on business matters, but also checking in on how I was doing as a person. I cultivated friendships with colleagues who seemed genuine, testing them slowly before allowing them closer. And eventually, I met someone. His name was David, and he was the antithesis of everything I had learned to expect from people. He was kind without ulterior motive, supportive without being possessive, interested in who I was rather than what I could give him. He had his own successful career, an architect, specializing in sustainable design, and had no need for my money or my connections. We met at a charity event, bonded over a shared skepticism of the performative philanthropy on display, and ended up talking until the venue staff politely asked us to leave. Our relationship developed slowly, both of us carrying wounds that made trust difficult, both of us learning to let down walls that had protected us for years. When I eventually told him my full story, the childhood abuse, the years of servitude, the elaborate revenge, all of it, he listened without judgment. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "What they did to you was unforgivable," he said finally, "but what you did with it, turning that pain into something powerful, something that helps other people, that's remarkable. You didn't let them win, Elena. You didn't let them define who you became." It was the first time anyone had said something like that to me, and it unlocked something I hadn't realized I was still holding back. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony at the beach house I had purchased on the coast. There were no elaborate decorations, no hundreds of guests, no social positioning, just the two of us, a few close friends, and the sound of waves crashing on the shore. Victoria wasn't invited, of course. Neither were Margit or Isabel, but I did think about them briefly as I stood in the sun and promised to spend my life with someone who truly saw me. They had tried to convince me I was nothing. They had stolen years of my life, tried to steal my identity, tried to steal everything my parents had left me. And yet here I was, healthy, wealthy, loved, while they lived with the consequences of their cruelty. There's a kind of peace that comes from that realization. Not triumph, exactly, but peace. The recognition that sometimes justice happens, even if it takes longer than you'd like, even if you have to be the one to make it happen. I said my vows, kissed my husband, and stepped into the next chapter of my life. About 3 years after my wedding, I received news that Victoria had passed away. The cause was heart failure, complicated by years of poor health that she had apparently neglected to address. Her funeral was small, just Margaret, Isabel, and a handful of acquaintances who still remembered the woman she had once pretended to be. I didn't attend, but I sent flowers. Not out of forgiveness, exactly, but out of some complicated emotion I couldn't quite name. Margaret called me a few days later. It was the first time we had spoken since the wedding confrontation years ago. "I wanted to thank you for the flowers," she said, her voice careful, guarded. "You didn't have to do that." "No," I agreed, "I didn't." There was a long pause. "I know you probably don't want to hear this from me," she continued, "but I've been thinking a lot about the past, about what we did to you, what our mother made us part of." "Made you part of?" I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. "You had choices, Margaret. Every time you laughed at me, every time you demanded I clean up your messes, every time you treated me like I was subhuman, those were choices." "I know," her voice cracked slightly. "I'm not making excuses. I was horrible to you, and I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway because it was easier than standing up to my mother. I was a coward and a bully, and I've had to live with that." I didn't respond, waiting. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I think about it, every day. I think about who I could have been if I had made different choices, and I'm sorry for all of it." I was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you, Margaret. What happened in that house marked me in ways I'm still discovering, but I'm not interested in holding on to anger anymore. It's too heavy, and I've been carrying it too long." "I understand. Good luck to you. I hope you find a way to live with what you've done." I hung up and sat for a while, looking out at the garden that had once been my prison and was now my sanctuary. Margaret's apology didn't change the past. It didn't heal the wounds, didn't restore the years that had been stolen from me, but it did represent something I hadn't expected, the possibility that people could change, that even those who had been complicit in cruelty could eventually recognize the weight of their actions. I didn't know if Margaret's remorse was genuine or just another performance, but I found that, ultimately, it didn't matter. Her journey was hers, mine was mine, and I had already traveled too far down my own path to be derailed by whatever remained of the family that had tried to destroy me. Last month, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse office. Yes, I have several homes now, including the mansion, and looked out at the city that had once seemed so impossibly far from the girl scrubbing floors in the basement. The foundation in my mother's name had helped over 5,000 young people in the past decade. My businesses employed thousands more, providing stable jobs with good benefits in an economy that offered too few of either. The wealth I had accumulated was being used, actively and intentionally, to make the world slightly less cruel. David stood beside me, his arm around my waist. Our daughter, a 5-year-old named after my mother, was inside with her nanny, probably making a mess of her art project as she always did. "What are you thinking about?" David asked. I considered the question. "I was thinking about how strange it is," I said. "The girl I used to be, the one who believed she was worthless, who couldn't imagine a future beyond serving people who despised her. She's still in here somewhere, part of me, but she's not in charge anymore." "Who is in charge?" I smiled. The woman who decided she deserved better, the woman who refused to let them define her story. David pulled me closer. Below us, the city hummed with the energy of millions of lives, each one carrying their own struggles and triumphs. "You know what I love most about you," he said. "Tell me." "You could have become bitter. After everything they did, you could have let the anger consume you, turned into someone hard and cruel. But you didn't. You used what happened to you to help other people, to build something meaningful." I thought about that. It would have been easier to become bitter, I admitted. There were times when I almost did, but then I realized that if I let them make me cruel, they would have won after all. They would have successfully turned me into a version of themselves. "And you weren't going to let that happen." "No," I said, "I wasn't." The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere out there, Margaret and Isabel were living their diminished lives, still dealing with the consequences of choices made years ago. Victoria was gone. Whatever peace or torment awaited her beyond this world already determined. And I was here, present, at peace, surrounded by love that I had never expected to find. The girl who had scrubbed floors and been told she was nothing had become a woman who owned buildings, employed thousands, and had reshaped her world according to her own design. They had tried to write my story for me. They had tried to convince me that my ending was already determined, a life of servitude and insignificance, the cautionary tale they could use to make themselves feel superior. But I had taken the pen from their hands. I had written my own ending. And as I stood on that balcony, watching the city lights begin to flicker on against the darkening sky, I allowed myself a moment of simple, profound gratitude. For my mother, who had loved me fiercely in the 8 short years we had together. For my father, who had tried in his flawed way to give me a path forward. For Mr. Hendricks, who had seen something worth saving in a frightened young woman. For David, who had taught me that love didn't have to come with conditions. For my daughter, who would grow up knowing every single day that she was valued and seen and enough. For myself, most of all, for the strength I hadn't known I possessed. For the patience that had allowed me to wait for the right moment. For the wisdom to recognize that the best revenge wasn't destruction, but simply living a life so full and so purposeful that those who had tried to diminish me became footnotes in a story that was no longer about them at all. I turned from the balcony and walked back inside, where my daughter was waiting to show me her latest masterpiece, a chaotic explosion of color that she proudly declared was our family. "It's beautiful," I told her and meant it. She beamed, threw her arms around my neck, and whispered, "I love you, Mommy." And in that moment, holding my daughter in the home I had built, surrounded by love I had never expected to find, I understood something that Victoria and her daughters would never understand. True wealth isn't measured in properties or portfolios. True success isn't determined by social standing or professional titles. True power isn't about controlling others or proving superiority. It's about these moments, this love, this peace. Everything else is just noise. And as I carried my daughter to the kitchen, where David was already pulling out ingredients for her favorite meal, I smiled to myself and thought about the journey that had brought me here. From the basement to the boardroom, from servant to CEO, from invisible to undeniable. Not bad for the slow girl they said would never amount to anything. Not bad at all.